It's an honor to have with us this morning Mayor Mitch Landrieu of New Orleans. In his second term, overwhelmingly reelected, I believe, last year.
903 days left.
There you go. Actually a lawyer by training.
And a mediator.
And previously lieutenant governor of the state of Louisiana, and before that a member of the House of the State House for
16 years. Lieutenant
right?
governor 6, mayor 5.
And I think what's particularly great about having you here today is you're attacking the entire thicket of problems that we're talking about. The whole system. You're trying to cut the jail population in New Orleans. You're cracking down, trying to root out violent crime at the same time. And I'd love to talk about that whole formula, beginning with decarceration, which is, the fancy word for this process. Before Katrina hit, New Orleans was incarcerating people, I think, at 5 times the national average. It's still really high there, but you've brought it down by 2/3. So how has that happened?
Well, first of all, Louisiana is probably the most over-incarcerated state in America, in a country that's the most over-incarcerated country in the world. So we fit right in the what would be called the sweet spot. Before I became mayor, I was a lieutenant governor, and when I was a lieutenant governor, I oversaw the reform of the juvenile justice system in New Orleans, and incidentally, in Louisiana. And incidentally, we found pretty much the same thing. We were putting too many of the wrong kids in an imprisoned environment, not enough of the right kids, and the kids that were the wrong kids we weren't treating well. The whole system was upside down. And interestingly enough, back then, there was a convergence between conservatives and liberals and moderates that nobody was getting what they wanted. We weren't getting a safe street. We weren't getting a reasonably priced system that produced a result that was really good, and the kids were actually getting worse, not better, which is really a prescription of what you see almost in the adult system. So now, even with the panel before us, you see now this kind of false argument. How can we fight violent crime, unless we keep the prisons high? And I think that one of the things we have to do is understand that nobody in America is going to not want to be tough on crime. And this is true irrespective of race, creed, color, or financial space. In the city of New Orleans, which is 65% African American, most of our citizens in New Orleans are living at a level below a 4-member family, making $35,000, even in the darkest, deepest, toughest, environments where people are not feeling good. Everybody wants to be safe. Everybody wants to be safe. And the issue that people are talking about in terms of reducing incarceration sometimes gets lost about violent crime versus nonviolent crime. And as we approach this subject, we really have to be smart about how we do it. So in New Orleans, which does not set the penal policy, by the way, for the state, the judges in New Orleans are state judges. We have 12 members on our bench. 9 of them are African American. They do not set the policy. The policy is set by the state. The big numbers that you guys are talking about right now is actually the federal government talking about the release. So that really hasn't, in a meaningful way, other than in Texas and some other states, hit the state levels. So nevertheless, though, the philosophy and the arguments are beginning to move down to the state level. And so we have raised the issue dramatically that we're over-incarcerating and we're not being smart about the individuals that we actually have in our jail. Now, for the city, besides it being a moral issue, it's a financial issue because they have some crazy thing where the state gets to say who's in jail and the city has to pay for it. So when I became the mayor and I had a $100 million hole in my budget and I couldn't fund recreation and I couldn't fund all of the other things that communities need, I started looking at that really hard and said, who actually is in the jail? Why are they in the jail? Why are they there for that long? And is there a better way to get it done? And when we started to get into that very rigorous exercise, we started to come up with thoughtful ways to not arrest everybody that we didn't have to. So in New Orleans, for some reason, when I got there, if we pulled you over and you didn't have your driver's license, we would actually take you to jail instead of giving you a summons to go to municipal court and figure out why you were driving without your thing. So we had a bucket load of thoughtless processes that were actually increasing the number of people that were in the jail that was costing the city more money.
And there was actually some financial incentives driving that too, right?
Well, this is about two things. I think Ta-Nehisi was right. It's about money and it's about safety. Those are really the two things. There is obviously a very strong moral argument to be made. And by the way, there is a consensus forming in this country right now that we're not doing it the right way. You see this on the presidential level. You see it in the Senate. You see it when folks on the left and the right are beginning to acknowledge, for whatever reasons, and you and I talked about what moment, and we ought to seize this moment. We really ought to seize this moment. We ought to have open ears and open eyes and listen to each other, because I'm in the business as a mayor of finding a solution to a problem. And so advocacy is really important. I'm not shortchanging it. I think the issue has now been raised. What we really need to spend a lot of time figuring out is how to. And the how to is not just what you want. It's what the other side will take as well. And you have to find a way to get them to say yes to what it is that you need. So if, in fact, it is about money, the question is who's got the money and who needs it? And how are you going to get it from there to here? And how are you going to spend it in a way that reflects that you're actually producing a more meaningful result? And that's why I think the conversation, it doesn't have to shift, but it has to expand to include a real pathway to a different place that I think all of us want to go.
So how have you been able to sustain political support, particularly in the early days? How were you able to build political support? At the time, the crime rate was still pretty high for this approach. Right.
Well, a couple of things. I think when you talk to folks in neighborhood meetings, which is where I get most of my information, they'll tell you. And, the public's pretty smart about this. And they know, and everybody knows, that the more money you spend up front, the less money you have to spend on the back end. The gentleman that was up here sitting on this side before was talking about the cost of crime versus the cost of incarceration. The cost of a person who kills somebody, to the person that got killed and to that person who killed, to society for the cost of putting him in jail for the rest of the life and the loss of his economic output for the rest of his life is about $7 million a murder. I think the economists have put that number on it. When you start adding that up, and you throw that into the mix, you realize that if you would have spent money maybe on early childhood education, you would have had, no, but I thank you for your applause, but it actually gets a little tougher. If you would have spent it on the front end in terms of early childhood education, enrichment programs, recreation programs, and you actually nurtured that soul into a better place, you formed, because all of us human beings need to be formed in some form or fashion by parents or the church or in some form or fashion, and we're formed into a great place and we have a great opportunity, we usually produce a better result. And so I think what we're talking about, as we should be talking about, just from the fiscal perspective, is are we spending the money that we have now allocated in a thoughtful way that's producing a good result? Why do we keep wasting it? That's why you asked me earlier, why is it now that the conservative side of the argument are beginning to think about this? I think it's from their perspective is twofold. It's monetary. In the instance of in the state of Louisiana, we went from spending $200 million on putting people in jail to $750 million a year. In the same time, we started spending less money on early childhood education, and then we were producing a bad result. From a mechanics point of view, taking philosophy aside, if you wanted government to work better, let's just say you were a fiscal hawk, you would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. So can we do something else? And I think that it gets a little confusing, though, and I just would encourage everybody in this room to be very thoughtful about this, that there are victims involved. And the victims, and I promise you, they're African American, they're white, they're poor, they're rich, want to make sure, y'all talked a little bit about retribution. That's not something that's new to everybody in America. There's a sense of that. There's a sense of punishment. There's a sense of justice on that side of it. And then there is a sense that we want to be safe. And one of the dangers that politicians face, elected judges, mayors, governors, is if you release somebody, and that person actually goes out and kills somebody else, not only is that a politically dangerous place to be, but you also have made a decision that hurts somebody else. And you really have to think through this in a very hard way. That doesn't mean we should go slow, but it does mean we should be intellectually curious and tough on each other about the how we get this done. And that doesn't mean we should wait or that we should go slow. It just means we should be smart about it.
Let's switch to the subject then of violent crime. You've been pursuing a very deliberate strategy in New Orleans to try to cut the murder rate.
Yeah.
What have you learned about the sources of violent crime from this?
Well, a couple things. First of all, so as not to be misunderstood by anybody in this room, the nation's over-incarcerated. We don't do the penal work of this country well, and we should spend a lot more money up front than on the back end. And the lack of procedural due process and equity in the system should be self-evident, and we have to keep working hard on all of that, especially the relationship between the police and the community. But while everybody is working on that, and it's an important thing for everybody to keep working on, what I have been not singularly focused on, but I would have to say most passionately focused on as I try to run the rest of the city, is the number of young African-American men that are being killed on the streets of New Orleans and America. America purports to feel good about herself because since the mid-1990s, we have reduced the murder rate in the country by about half. Around 1996, it was about 20,000 people were killed. It's now about 14,000. That's a dramatic drop, notwithstanding the fact that 14,000 is still more than any other industrialized nation in the world. But if you look at who the victims are, African-American men make up about 4 or 5% of the population of the United States of America. They're 40% of the victims of violent crime. And when you look at the iteration, our young men are killing each other, and they know each other. So the country wants to look away from this for a whole bunch of different reasons. In the city of New Orleans, it's somewhat of an epidemic. And I think it's true in about 74, 75 neighborhoods in the country. You saw the other day in Chicago, Tishon was killed, 9-year-old boy. In New Orleans, tomorrow I'm going home because 2 young men are going to be sentenced for the death of a girl, Breonna Allen, who's 5 years old, who had her guts blown out by an AK-47 when these 2 young men who were trying to shoot her father just decided to strafe their birthday party and instead hit her and didn't hit him. He subsequently, the father, was arrested for another murder. Now he's in jail for the rest of his life. That level of violent activity on the streets is something that has to be really looked at and addressed. It's got a lot of different reasons why it exists. It's got a lot of different answers to it, but that kind of thing really makes it hard for kids in the neighborhood actually to get up and get to school and actually move on to the places where they ought to be gone, which is Howard and Morehouse and Harvard and all of those other places. And I've been spending a lot of time in the neighborhoods talking to these young men. And one of the things that we do is what's called a call-in, where we actually ask some of these young men who are on probation or parole to come into the courtroom. I'm there. I have the U.S. attorney, the district attorney, the ATF, the DEA, the FBI, every bit of might in the world that the United States has standing behind me on my left. On my right, though, I have Sister Mary Sue, I have Pastor, I have mental health professionals, I have job professionals, and we look at these young men and say, look, you're really important to us. We love you. You might have made some bad decisions in your life. It's okay. But here's the thing. You got to stop the violence. And if you do that, I, as the mayor, am going to put you first in line in front of every citizen in the city. You are going to be the most important thing in my life, and I am going to give you what it is that you need. But if you choose badly and you go back out and you go, pull out a gun and you start strafing the neighborhood, I wouldn't be much of a mayor if I wasn't responsible for the safety of all of the children. We have to incarcerate you, and we have to incarcerate you for as long as it's necessary for you to decide that you can't do that. We've been trying to at least let these young men know that they're critically important, that we know who they are, we know where they are, and that has been working to a certain extent. The other thing is it's helping raise the consciousness level that violence in all of its iterations is bad, irrespective of what community it's in. And getting that to the higher level, though, I have to be honest with you, is somewhat of a challenge, because not everybody cares in this country about poor young African-American men who are being shot and who are shooting. They care about a lot of other stuff, all of us in this room, but I don't find that it's as easy as I thought it would be if I told everybody in this room that 628,000 American citizens were killed on the streets of America since 1980. That's more American citizens that were killed in all of the wars of the 20th century. That would be World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. And sometimes when I say that, people yawn, maybe because they don't care, maybe it's too big, maybe it's too hard to get your head around. But to me, it's a national and a moral outrage, and there needs to be some attention focused on that issue, and I'm trying to do it.
I'm going to open it up to you guys after this question. Do you just talk a little more about, you said a moment ago it's working to a certain extent. How do you measure it? What's the impact?
Well, first of all, in New Orleans, we're doing a lot of other stuff. So on the front end, I've tripled the amount of money that we spend on recreation. I have really tried to invest also in art, music, anything that we can do to touch kids. So I'm from New Orleans, so we like food, we like music. If you come to the city, everybody's got a horn in their hand, and that's true because it's part of our culture. I know you guys saw that Alan Toussaint passed the other day, one of the great musicians that has given the world a great gift. If we can find a way to educate our young children, either through music, through arts and sciences, all of those things, the more that we can do. So with massive investments in that. We're also physically rebuilding every school in the city of New Orleans. Literally, we're rebuilding 38 schools to give our children great spaces to be in. I have job training programs where I'm trying to identify all of the folks in the city that are not working, creating specific pathways to a job to anchor institutions in the city. So everybody knows this because you live in a place that's got something like Johns Hopkins by you, right? But in the shadow of these major institutions, you have people live in the neighborhood that actually don't even work in the institution. So we're trying to take our universities, our hospitals, and we're saying when you come to work, drive in from the suburbs and go into the parking lot and go upstairs, take a minute and go take a walk and look around the neighborhood and identify the people that live in this space who probably pay the property taxes that support the tax break that you got to build this thing. And make sure, because they're there. Now, you've got a problem because you don't have enough people to work, and they've got a problem because they got too many people that don't have work. Can't we figure out a way how to train these individuals for a job? So we're building 2 new beautiful medical centers, one by the VA and one by the University Medical Center, and they're immediately adjacent to neighborhoods that have people in it that don't have work. Well, in those institutions, you can be a phlebotomist, you can be a med tech, you can do physical therapy, you can go to Xavier right down the street, which produces more African-American doctors than any other university in the country, or you could be the person that leads it. And we're trying to create those economic connections, not just theoretically, but literally finding the person with the human resource person and creating a pathway they can get from here to there.
But what is the bottom line in terms of the crime rate of all this effort? Where do things stand today?
Well, we have the murder rate and the number of murders is as low as it has been since 1971. Now, that is a very good thing. However, our 1971 rate is still 8 times higher than the national average. So one of the things that mayors of America are talking about, and we've visited with the Department of Justice about this, is you got to focus time, attention, and resources. I'll just give you a couple of numbers. But Congress used to invest more money in substance abuse, mental health. Everybody talks about the community policing. Well, it's easy to do when you have more police officers who are trained well. If you don't have a lot of police officers and they're not trained well, that creates stress and strain. The COPS program, back in the day, the federal government held with 100,000 police officers on the street. And so, again, if you think about front end and back end, and there was a really targeted investment in helping human beings, right, become better, and you had really targeted investments for early childhood education, Head Start, nurse practitioner program, the kind of things that help families stay together and be strong, that give them opportunities and economic opportunity, then you would have less of a problem that you actually have to fix. And if the police officers were hired, and there were a lot of them, and they were trained with school resources officers, and they were trained in the right way, in the kind of procedural justice that we think, we should have now, you would begin to produce a better result. But I think that look, this is a very serious problem. It's a very deep problem. It's one that's going to take a very, very long time. I would caution the country not to get stuck in the argument about whose fault it is that we got here. Because as I like to say, I don't know who's going to win that argument. I know that it'll be a big fight, and I don't know whose fault it is, although I have my ideas. But I do know whose responsibility it is to fix it. And because we're in this moment where the country seems to have an open mind and an open heart about it, I think the conversation ought to be tough and constructive, and we ought to move the ball forward dramatically, and I think we have that opportunity. If Congress can't agree on anything else, it seems that they're open to thinking about this, and we ought to take them up on their offer and try to give them some really direct answers to the questions of what am I supposed to do about it.
All right, let's please go to the audience here. Is there a mic?
Good morning. My name is Charles Curtis. I'm a clinical and school psychologist. I work in behavior intervention at E.L. Haynes Public Charter School, specifically at the high school. The quick context for my question is the Atlantic ran an article in December 2014 that focused pretty heavily on charter schools in New Orleans in particular. And I'm curious in some ways about the content of that article and how the mayor takes position on that. And just, again, quick background, the content of the article was talked heavily about the no excuses, in many ways, exclusionary policies of a lot of charter schools in general, and it talks specifically about some of the practices in charter schools in New Orleans. And I'm curious about the mayor's position as how those discipline policies, inclusive of suspension, exclusion from classroom, and so on, may relate to that front-end, back-end discussion of prison and what we do on the front end in terms of what we do on the back end.
Did you say you worked in a charter school?
Yes, sir.
You like
yes,
it?
Sir. Say again?
You like it?
Oh, I love it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I just joking.
Oh, I love it.
There is a,
My question is primarily about the mayor's position on the discipline policies in the school.
Yeah,
so
no,
the charter piece is honestly not super relevant to me. It's much more around the mayor's position on the discipline policy.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I want to tell you what my position on charter schools is, and then I'll answer you. And then I'll answer your question. There are a couple of things because there's a big fight in the country about what's the proper governance model that will give our kids an opportunity. In New Orleans, what he's alluding to is that post-Katrina, we went to a different system of educating. Before we had a school board, it was a centralized system. The board didn't function really well. 80% of our kids were going to schools that were failing, not teaching. And we decided to do something different because the school board couldn't get their brain off of adult issues that are serious, but they weren't the ones that people think they should be focused on. It was generally employer-employee relationships. It was a union versus management fight. Y'all have seen and heard of it 1,000 times. Before the end of this year, 100% of our kids will be in charter schools. I'm just going to give you the results. The graduation rates are going way up. Dropout rates are going way down. Achievement gap between African-American kids in the city and white kids in the suburb has closed completely over 5 years. And the reasons those things are working is not necessarily because they're charters or they're typical public schools, but because there is some level of parental choice, there's some accountability, the principal and the teachers can run the school, and it seems to be producing a good result. Now, what he's alluding to are the suspension policies that existed in the public schools and in the charter schools, and he's completely right about it. And this was part of juvenile justice reform. It's like, how it's like a kid gets in trouble and it's suspend first and ask questions later. That's wrong. You shouldn't do that. And what we're doing in the schools in New Orleans is reworking those policies, because you have to make sure that the children have the resources they need to learn how to have their behavior formed in a positive way. And that separate and suspend first rather than have an ability to work with them over time is just wrong. And I think that early on in the charter schools, one of the real challenges was that. One of the challenges was how you deal with special needs kids. They weren't handling that very well. And they really weren't handling the expulsion policies very well. That had less to do whether they were charters or typical public schools than it did with how schools treat children that are in trouble and that need help. And they have to get a lot better at that. All schools across the state does, and really across the country. You saw episodes about it. And what's happened in New Orleans, by the way, there's nothing unique about us except that we have better food, music, and fun than everybody else in the world. But other than that, everything else is pretty much the same.
Can we take one more quick question in the front here?
Sure.
Very patient gentleman.
Thank you very much. I'm Alexander Kravitz. I don't work anything in this sector. I'm just here to try to learn something. Very impressive presentation. Thank you very much. At the risk of taking us off topic, I heard about your experience as a state legislature, running a state, now running a city. Any thought in the future? Congress, White House?
No.
No?
I'm not thinking about that at the moment. But
time.
thank you for the offer, though.
I'm not sure he was making. I don't know if he was. Yeah. Let's go back here.
Some lady told me on the plane today she didn't like me and she'd never vote for me. She couldn't wait for me to get out of office.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Patan. I'm with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Also a fellow Louisianan, and thank you for being here, Mary.
Where are you from?
Baton Rouge.
All right.
Yeah. So James asked you about political support. I'm wanting to know about constituent support. Specifically, what are your messaging strategies when you're talking to your constituents and you're trying to build consensus about the reforms that we all know are necessary, but there's high crime levels right now?
Can I say we're going to have to leave it on this question, and it's a great one to end with. So
Yeah, I'll
go
try to.
big on how do we sustain
I'll go
political
big and I'll go
consensus
deep.
around this. Yes, please.
I know that this room is full of really smart people who have researched a lot, and I would put in the category of advocates for a big idea. And that's really, really, really important. But when you get down to the level that I work on, which really is really, really low and is on the ground, that's what mayors do. I mean, unlike a congressman or a senator or really even a president, when you're 40, 50,000, 60,000 feet away from your policies, when a policy is enunciated on the city level, it gets implemented, and you actually see the people who it affects. If you don't believe me, try to raise the parking rates in the city of New Orleans and see if, or try to take away to-go cups. You want to see people get emotional about something in America? Try to take away their to-go cups. You wonder why they care more about that than they do about this, but they do. And so when I go, messaging to constituents, I'm being able to test the things you guys are talking about today. And I'm going to tell you something that I know. If you go tell anybody in the city, and it doesn't really matter whether they're rich or poor, African American or white, especially in poor African American neighborhoods, that you're going to do something that's going to make them unsafe, even if it's the young man who they know lives down the street, that if he pulls out a gun, they're going to go to jail for the rest of their life. If their child is at risk, they're going to say, take him. I'm telling you, it's not a theoretical thing for folks on the street. And so the challenge is, for me, from a messaging perspective, how do you get people to think about theoretically what's right, practically what's right, and then personally what makes them safe? And then if you ask somebody, is that an idea that you want to do? And they say yes, and you say, okay, well, now I'm going to raise your property taxes to do it. Fund early childhood education. Do something else regarding drug or substance abuse. I'm going to build a mental hospital that is a state responsibility. All of a sudden, in real life, in real time, when it's not theoretical anymore, you actually have to figure out how to do it. And that is really the hardest thing. That's going to be the biggest challenge. In this country right now, and again, I would just end with this. We have a moment where there is an open mind, an open heart, and open eyes to fixing this problem. And I would really encourage both sides or all iterations of this debate to listen and to hear each other, because you can move the ball. Generally in American politics, we don't move in huge footsteps. We move in incremental waves, and then we go look back at what we did, and if it was good, we keep going. I would seize that moment. But in order to do it, the strong advocates on both sides are going to have to not just advocate, but come up with the how-to, the who, the when, the how much, and the who's going to pay. And if you can answer all of those questions, and you can give the public writ large, nationally, state level, and local level, a good sense that you're going to produce a better product, right? They're going to say yes to that every day. It's getting through that forest of very difficult thickets and weeds in a way that doesn't vilify the other side, that will get you to a better place. And at the end of the day, it's about making those American citizens that are now over-incarcerated, because I visit with them all of the time. A lot of those folks can come back into the community, but they've got to have a place to go. They've got to have training to get there, and it takes money to create that. It's a real problem that needs to be solved. It should be solved. Now's the moment. We should seize it, and let's see if we can get somewhere.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you. Thank you.